Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to week 3 live consultation hour for ELECTRO 3. Right now, I am waiting for students to come in this live stream. While I'm waiting for students to come in, let's check the chat, the comment section below if we have any questions right now. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, welcome to week 3 live consultation hour for Electro 3. Right now, we're still waiting for students to come in. So, good afternoon, everyone. If you can hear my audio, please acknowledge in the comment section if you can hear me. I'm checking my audio. So right now we're still waiting for students to come in the live stream, and I will now start reading questions. So first question we have from Mr. Saison. What is the main reason for using high voltage equipment on board? When you are on board, you will be dealing with um, equipment that uses high levels of voltage to power up applications that require heavy mechanical output, or usually heavy mechanical output, specifically applications that require, or specifically electric motors that require high levels of voltage. So that's the main reason for using high voltage equipment on board. Thank you for your question, Mr. Sison. Next question we have James T. Who is James T? How can we identify if the equipment on board is high voltage or not? Uh, direct. Well, to be sure, you have to read the main circuit diagrams in the engine control room, and you have to read the indications in the label. Usually high voltage equipment has warnings on the sides or markings because these are dangerous levels of voltages. And quickly, if there are no signs or markings, you can quickly recognize high voltage equipment with the radius or the diameter of your cable or wire. Usually with these applications, you're going to see thicker and heavier wires and cables. So if you don't have time to read the main diagram, or the entire electrical plant diagram, and you have no time to read the markings, just a quick indication would be the diameter of your wires and cables, which are usually large and thick in size. Thank you for your question, Mr. Who was that? James T. Who is James T? James Tongko. Thank you for your question, Mr. Tongko. Next question, we have from Mr. Ornopia. Good afternoon, Mr. Ornopia. What are examples of high voltage equipment on board? Any equipment that uses more than 1000 volts are classified as high voltage equipment on board. These are usually the large motors, electric motors, and uh, thrusters. Thank you for your question, Mr. Hornopia. Next question we have from Mr. Veloso. What are some equipment? So the equipment is a wrong word. It you cannot put an S at the end of equipment. So what are some equipment or machinery? Machinery is also wrong. Machineries is wrong. You cannot have a plural version of, or the plural version of machinery is still machinery. So what are some equipment or machinery on board that uses high voltage to operate? So I have answered that previously from Mr. Ornopia's question. Usually the equipment that uses large electrical motors. Next we have, thank you for your question, Mr. Veloso. I'm also reading questions from our live chat in our group. So next question we have from Mr. Meral. Good afternoon, Mr. Meral. What are the common most used high voltage equipment on board? Uh, I have answered that. So we have equipments that use the large electric motors. So those are typically our high voltage equipment on board. Next we have Mr. Baguio. Good day, Mr. Baguio. Why high voltage system used on ships? Why are high voltage systems used on ships? So I have answered this at the start. High voltage systems are used on ships because sometimes you're going to need um, applications that require heavy work or heavy mechanical power, and in implementing such power, you're going to use electrical motors that require high voltages. Thank you for your question, Mr. Bagyo. Next question is from Mr. Aklaw. What will be the maximum and minimum voltage that that is have on the ship, that you have on the ship. The high voltages, so these are classified as voltages greater than 1000 volts. Those are considered as high voltage. So usually these are in the range of 3 point or 3 kilovolts, 6 kilovolts. So that's 3000, 6000 volts. And those are the typical maximum or the large voltages. We have 12,000. And for minimum, uh, not counting the millivolts used in electronics. So for DC, radio, hand tools, lighting, we have 5 volts, 12 volts. Smaller batteries, 1.5 volts. So those are your minimum voltages. Usually coming from batteries, DC batteries. Thank you for your question, Mr. Aklau. Our next question is from Mr. Rosalejos. What is classified as high voltage? So on board, any equipment that uses uh, voltage greater than 1000 volts are considered as high voltage. Let me check the our group chat if we have any questions. Okay, next question is from Mr. Tampos. So Mr. Tampos is asking what is the function itself or the flow on how to operate. What is the function itself or the flow on how to operate? I suppose you're asking yeah, with respect to high voltage devices. Those are discussed, or some examples are given in our handouts in our for this topic. So thank you for your question, Mr. Tampos. Next question is from Mr. Dalagan. Good afternoon, Mr. Dalagan. Is there a limit of how much voltage can a high voltage equipment take? Yes, you have to read the sticker pasted on the equipment or the manufacturer's manual or any indication on the side, the nameplate, which usually indicates the limits, not just for voltage but for currents, power, and all other specification or electrical parameters that uh, a certain equipment may be exposed to. Thank you for your question, Mr. Dalagan. Next question we have from Mr. Darling. What might happen, sir, if there is a shortage of voltage? Uh, Usually, if there is a shortage of voltage, your equipment will not function, it will not turn on, or if it will turn on, it will operate at a low output. For example, if you have a light that is underpowered, it will still light up, but or it might still light up, but the illumination will be lower. Or if your motor is underpowered, it might still run, but uh, it will run slowly or slower than its intended function. But usually, because we have control systems that will detect whether you have the correct voltage and current for a certain equipment, then chances are it will totally not function. Thank you for your question, Mr. Darling. Next question is from Mr. Ayop. What is the best safety protection in dealing in high voltage? I will not answer that question because that is an answer for your CO3. You have to tell me the safety precautions and the safety procedures. You have to develop safety procedures in dealing with high voltage equipment. So, but in general, electrical safety is discussed in our handouts for this topic. But uh, in specific safety precautions in using specific equipment, that's part of your CO3. So you have to answer that question. Thank you for your question, Mr. Ayop. Next question is from Mr. Giritan. Good afternoon, Mr. Giritan. What are the common disadvantages of using high voltage equipment on board? Common disadvantages of using high voltage, it is using higher voltages increases the risk of arcing. When we see arcing, you would have uh, uh, an electricity will jump from a conductor to a place that's not part of the its conductive path. So if you can a demonstration of this would be lightning, or if you have seen a Tesla coil, so you will clearly see an arc from a conductor going to a place that's not supposed to go. Or maybe in welding, you can see an arc that will connect, or it will travel through air. So that's what we call as arcing, when electricity travels through air and it goes through a path that is not intended for it to travel through. So the higher the voltage you use, the bigger chance of producing arcs. So it's more dangerous, and so that's a common disadvantage of using high voltage equipment. It's in general more dangerous to deal with. So you have a special to follow special safety precautions. So next is we have next. Thank you for your question, Mr. Giritan. Next question is from Mr. Pia. What is the highest voltage level on ship? It depends on the ship. So you have applications that use 3000 volts, 6000 volts, 12, 11, 12,000 volts. So those are typical high levels of voltages used on board. Thank you for your question, Mr. Pia. Next question is from Mr. King. Good afternoon, Mr. King. Your question is how can we make sure that the high voltage equipment on board can be modified in order for it to be used for low voltage purposes? So you use transformers for that, step down transformers. Thank you for your question, Mr. King. Next question is from Mr. Cañete. Good afternoon, Mr. Cañete. What are the disadvantages and advantages of using high voltage equipment? The disadvantages, it's more dangerous. It's very dangerous. That's the main disadvantage, and the advantage would be it will allow you to produce higher uh, power output. So usually mechanical power pertaining to the use of electrical motors, that is. So thank you for your question, Mr. Cañete. Next question is from Mr. Iman. Good afternoon, Mr. Iman. What voltage is used on ships? You have low voltage or voltages less than 1000 volts up to 1000 volts, and high voltage, which are voltages above 1000. And what volt we have AC and DC. So thank you for your question, Mr. Iman. Next question is from Mr. Maderazo. What are the tools needed in terms of high voltage? So some of the tools are presented in our handouts, and some of the specific tools, especially in the handling of um, circuit breakers and generators, you have to discuss that as part of your procedures that you will develop yourself for our CO3. Thank you for your question, Mr. Maderazo. Next question is from Mr. Boncales. Mr. Boncales, your question is, what are the type of high voltage equipment on board? So usually you have thrusters, pole thrusters, and high voltage motors, like the ones used in cranes for loading and unloading. Uh, those are usually motors that uh, require it to have lots of power in its output, because you're going to be lifting a lot of heavy loads. So you need a lot of electricity to power those motors that lift those cargo. Thank you for your question, Mr. Boncales. Uh, Next question is from Mr. Uy. How does grounding improve the safeness of dealing high voltage on board? Proper grounding is essential to prevent. Sir? Yes, sir. So, Mr. Uy's question is, how does grounding improve the safeness or the safety of dealing with high voltages on board? Grounding is essential to prevent unwanted circuit faults, specifically ground faults. You don't want to be touching high voltage equipment and then have a ground fault with that sort of equipment. So you need to use a very large measure to check the insulation resistances and to make sure that there's no ground fault in your high voltage equipment. Thank you for your question, Mr. Uy. Our next question is from Mr. Ando. Good day, Mr. Ando. What type requires high voltage operation? So, what type of equipment? So, any equipment that uses more than 1000 volts. Mr. Baritwa is asking, define what is high voltage on board. So, again, that's any equipment that uses more than 1000 volts. Thank you for your questions, Mr. Ando, Mr. Baritwa. Next question is from Mr. Petiluna. Good afternoon, Mr. Petiluna. What are ways to prevent any risk and dangers when dealing with high voltage equipments? I will not answer that question because that's part of your exam. So I want you to answer that question, Mr. Petiluna, and some of the basic ways or precautions are presented in our handouts, but in terms of the specific ways or steps, you have to answer that in our exam. You have to develop your own procedure. Thank you for your question, Mr. Petiluna. Next question is from Mr. Gulay. Good afternoon, Mr. Gulay. What is the maximum voltage on board and what equipment is that? So we don't have any maximum voltage. It depends on your ship. As I have discussed a while ago, the different equipment that might use high voltages. Thank you for your question, Mr. Gulay. Okay, reconnecting. So I guess it was disconnected. By the way, we have just answered questions from uh, Mr. Ando, Mr. Baritwa, Mr. Petiluna, Mr. Gulay, and right now I'm answering Mr. Petiluna's second question. Does high voltage equipment produce tremendous heat? Yes. So generally yes. So if your high voltage equipment usually produces or uses high currents, yeah, so it is the current that translates to heat in your conductors. So it's not the voltage itself, but the current flow that flows through the conductors, and uh, as a result, it produces heat. Which is more dangerous, high AC or high DC? Both are dangerous. AC is more dangerous. So if they are the same, AC is more dangerous. It has a higher chance of arcing, and in general, AC is more dangerous if they have the same amount of voltage. Thank you for your question, Mr. Petiluna. Next question is from Mr. Sabute. Good afternoon, Mr. Sabute. What is the effect of short circuit fault in high voltage system? Usually, you're going to see fires and sparks, small explosions. Short circuits would be louder, expectedly. It will produce a louder sound because of the high voltages involved. So thank you for your question, Mr. Sabote. Sabote, I will now check the our group if you have any questions from our group chat. So no more questions. I guess that's all. So I have answered all the questions from the group chat and from the comment section. Thank you for participating in this week 3 live consultation hour for Electro 3. See you again next week. Thank you.